Thanks very much, Colin. And thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. I first became interested in Le Fanu about 30-something years ago when I was doing an MA in UCC in Cork, and I did an MA thesis on Sheridan Le Fanu at that point. Then we parted company for some years, and it's only in the last couple of years that I've actually sort of gone back to his work in a slightly different context. I became interested in urban ghosts because they're actually kind of a relatively rare entity in 19th century fiction. There are a lot of haunted country houses, haunted wayside inns and things like that, but there actually aren't that many urban ghosts. But among the ones that there are in Victorian short fiction, there are some by Le Fanu. That's how I came back to Sheridan Le Fanu, which brought me to William, because I think the two actually do fit together in thinking about the urban and technology and the ghosting. Anyway, without further ado, so it's actually not that easy to track the railway through Le Fanu's stories. There aren't much in the way of railways. He tends to eschew the kind of recent public transport available, and instead we have a haunted omnibus in Green Tea. We have a slightly phantasmagoric coach ride in Uncle Silas, where a woman starts off in one place and goes on a long journey, which she thinks is going to take her to France, and in the end she finds herself back where she started. And there's a number of other stories like that in which transport kind of goes badly awry, but they're not usually railway journeys. So my argument, I suppose, is that to bring Le Fanu senior and junior together, we actually have to proceed a little differently and look at what I would think of as, I suppose, the way in which Sheridan Le Fanu captures certain emotions of the arrival of the railways, certain aspects of industrial affect, you could call it, I suppose. So just two stories I want to talk about. One is the Watcher from 1847, which appeared in the Dublin University magazine, not actually associated with Trinity College at that point. It was just a commercial magazine. And that story he returned to as was his way. He was a great reworker of his material, and a recycler and upcycler before his time. Partly because he was running a magazine and needed content. He was always recycling material. So he reworks that as the familiar in his last and best collection, I think, of ghost stories, Darkly. And the other story is Green Tea, probably with Carmilla, his best known story, which first appeared in Charles Dickens' magazine all the year round, and then also was rewritten for In a Glass Darkly. So in these stories, we don't have the haunted houses and haunted stately homes and wayside inns. We actually have haunted modern streets and haunted public transport. So what I'm interested in doing is bringing that together with William Le Fanu's work. In the past, I think I, like many others, was inclined to kind of read the stories a little differently, and to read those stories of haunted and sort of besieged protagonists as to do with, well, an aspect of the landscape as we've been looking at, but actually not so much the nature aspect as the human aspect of landscape. You probably can't read that piece in the bottom right hand corner there, but it's actually an account of how William Le Fanu was attacked by angry tenants as he tried to collect discounted tithes from the local Catholic tenants. And many people in the past have read Le Fanu as kind of capturing that aspect of the Protestant minority's experience in early 19th century Ireland, that it's an experience of feeling slightly besieged, feeling slightly anxious, and often with during the 1830s at least, with quite good reason. The landscape was quite hostile. Anyway. So the railways, when they came, they brought a number of things. They brought a great economic boom for a period. There was a railway mania, which I think we'll probably hear a bit more about as well. So sort of a speculative frenzy really around this new transport technology. It was going to make everybody rich, and of course it didn't work out quite like that. But it did mean there was a frenzy of building, and some lines, as we've heard, didn't become successful. Some did, but it did mean that for quite a while, actually more than a decade, Dublin in particular, but other cities besides and the countryside, were alive with the sound of pickaxes and shovels as huge swathes were being dug up and lines were laid, and so on. So it was quite a lively period in the infrastructure of the country. So I've given a few of the dates there. So the first rail journey in Ireland is 1834. And actually, William Le Fanu was on that train, which went from Dunleary or Kingstown to Westland Row, now Stáisiún na Bíorsach, or Pearse Street, or Pearse Station rather. That was the first rail line in Ireland, and William Le Fanu, I think it was probably still a student at that point, had somehow managed to wangle a ticket for that journey. And he's involved in quite a lot of other things, but in the meantime, Amiens Street Station is built, King's Bridge is built. 1847, work begins on the Harcourt Street rail line, which we hear less about. And of course, there was the railway speculators of Ireland had their own newspaper, the Irish Railway Gazette. There was a lot of interest and a lot of disruption and carving up of landscape. I've cheated a little bit with that photograph there. That one is not actually of Dublin, but I could not find a photograph of railway construction in Dublin. Somebody else could probably point me towards one. That one's actually of London, but very similar digging would have happened, I'm confident. Anyway, so William Le Fanu, as I said, bore that first train, worked on the Dublin-Drogheda line as is one of his first projects, and as we've heard, he then becomes involved in the Great Southern and Western line from Dublin to Cork and sundry others. He didn't get to build everything, so in the 1860s there was a plan to link Dublin's main railway termini, so the first one, the Westland Row Station, and the one at what my mother still refers to as King's Bridge, alias Euston Station, and as astute observers of Irish public transport will have noted, there is still no rail link between those stations, but one was mooted in the 1860s and didn't get very far. It didn't get very far because people were actually anxious about the degree of disruption that was going to be involved, and vested interests stood in the way of this, probably quite needed piece of infrastructure. London was much the same, right? There was a southern and northern terminal, and in the middle you had some very expensive real estate that was the owners of which were not going to kind of cheerfully allow people to drive lines through it. So William Le Fanu came up with a plan for this, which never was realised. And this from Freeman's Journal from 1868. Mr. Le Fanu's line will leave Westland Row and the important part of Great Brunswick Street, or Pearse Street, uninjured, and will pass under the Lear Street, Fleet Street and Westmoreland Street, leaving these important portions of the city just as they stand at present. Mr. Barry, on the other hand, proposes a viaduct right through the city, passing every street from Aston's Quay, Parliament Street, Wine Tavern Street, all of them, say 12 or more in number, by bridges. Mr. Le Fanu proposes to reach the same destination by again causing his line to dip at the Cross Parliament Hill, Cork Hill and Christchurch Place by a tunnel. So William Le Fanu actually had the less intrusive of the lines, whereas Barry wanted to carve the place up. So he basically wanted to take what we see here of the entrance to Westland Row Station and to extend that kind of at that same height right across Dublin. And this caused a certain amount of controversy, and we see this in a sort of a pamphlet written in the 1860s called "Dublin Destroyed, or the Witches' Cauldron of Railway Horrors" of 1862. You'll recognise it. It's a parody of Macbeth, complete with witches. So second witch says, "Through each house and through each shop, nothing shall our progress stop. Let us e'en persuade the cits against their senses and their wits that each bridge across the street would be an architectural treat." And the railway sprite, alias Barry, reference to Barry. Westmoreland Street we've most, I think, to fear, and next to that the Battle of Daly. Dublin, Dublin, all great trouble in, we must lay our rails through Dublin. So, general kind of sense that there was going to be mayhem caused by the railways, and there was a certain amount of mayhem caused by the railways. The worst of it was probably constrained. Which takes us to the brother, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who never really writes directly about this kind of stuff. But I think if we twist the arm of the stories a little bit, we can kind of see how we can read them as having to do with that phase of rapid and dramatic construction of railways, not so much the 1860s as the first wave in the 1840s. So, in The Watcher, if you haven't read it recently, we have a very typical sort of Le Fanu scenario. Our central character is going along in his prosperous life. He's a retired sea captain, in this case Captain Barton, who's back from working for the Navy. And even though he's a relatively kind of middle-aged bachelor, he decides that he's going to marry. And he spends a lot of his time traipsing from his rented apartments on the, as it's called in the story, then fashionable part of the south side of the city to the house where his, well, not quite betrothed, but nearly betrothed lives on the north side of the city. So he's walking through the city centre pretty regularly. And as he's doing so, he begins to experience a form of spectral persecution. So a sort of diminutive human figure begins to follow. First he hears footsteps, then he sort of sees this diminutive figure, and eventually it turns to more active persecution. Shots are fired, and threats are made, and written warnings are received. And again, in a fairly familiar Le Fanu pattern, the unfortunate Captain Barton is eventually driven mad and frightened to death. It's not an uncommon ending to the Le Fanu short story. They're not always cheery short stories, really. They're meant for entertainment, which we should bear in mind, I think. Anyway, so this begins to happen, I think, in ways that do allow us to connect up to the great railway digging of the 1840s. So the first haunting happens in an unfinished street, quote, which had as yet merely been laid out with little more than the foundations of the houses constructed. And it's then, I'll skip along lightly, he hears the footfalls there. And then later in the story, when things are getting worse again, the road on either side was embarrassed by the foundations of a street beyond which extended waste fields full of rubbish and neglected lime and brick kilns. And there are also references to sort of foundations and sort of dwarf houses and so on. Sort of, it's this image of Dublin as sort of half-built, bricks half-baked, if you like. Now, the story is set in the past, I should mention, but I'd be inclined to read it as really a story about the 1840s and about that moment when the city is actually itself being broken up with a view to being rebuilt. So I see these stories as a little bit like Elizabeth Bowen's World War II short stories, which are also ghost stories, in which the Blitz in London in the 1940s leads to the release of these kind of supernatural forces that have been presumably, lying dormant for a number of years, but somehow the shaking of the physical infrastructure of the city has let them loose. They've come out of the nooks and crannies where they've been hidden. And that's kind of how I read The Watcher, that the disruption of Dublin has led to this particular incidence of persecution by what's described as a system, malignant and inexorable, quite railway-like in its way. The little adage you probably can't read, especially if your eyes are as bad as mine, is actually for land for sale around Amiens Street, and pointing out that this would be convenient new railway station and there were great opportunities there for builders. It's actually addressed as to capitalists. So the second story, Green Tea, is a little different, though it's a similar dynamic. We have, again, a middle-aged bachelor, prosperous, in this case, the unfortunate Reverend Mr. Jennings, who is a great student of arcane pagan material, which I think we're probably meant to think might have some kind of, not just pagan, but possibly lascivious content. Is not quite clear in the story. But he is going about his business, keeps himself awake during his perpetual studies by drinking vast quantities of green tea, hence the name of the story. And in his case, rather than it being kind of a diminutive watcher who follows him in the street, it's a small spectral monkey that appears when he's travelling home on an omnibus one evening. So omnibus or bus, as we'd say. This story is set in London, and set back a little bit in time. But again, I'd be inclined to read it really as about the 1860s when it was written, perhaps, and about Dublin rather than London. It's a whole other kind of aside here, but Le Fanu often wrote stories set in English settings because that was where the market was. It's kind of like the way John Connolly, the contemporary crime writer, sets his stories in America, because that's where the largest Anglophone reading audience is. Practical commercial considerations, which even invisible princes must pay attention to. Anyway, so the Reverend Mr. Jennings, he comes out of his house, chock full of green tea, presumably. On coming out, seeing no cab near, I was tempted to get into the omnibus which used to drive past this house. So that the house is in downtown London, but his country house is in Richmond, outside the city. I began now to perceive an outline of something black, and I soon saw with tolerable distinctness the outline of a small black monkey, pushing its face forward in mimicry to meet mine. Those were its eyes, and I now dimly saw its teeth grinning at me. I drew back, not knowing whether it might not meditate a spring. I fancied that one of the passengers had forgot this ugly pet, and wishing to ascertain something of its temper, though not caring to trust my fingers to it, I poked my umbrella softly towards it. It remained immovable. Up to it, through it, for through it and back and forward it passed, without the slightest resistance. And there's a picture of an omnibus to remind you what they look like. They're basically kind of, they're large carriages for the public. Most people end up sitting on the outside, but there's also an interior space. And of course, they actually became more numerous. We might think of them as a sort of an older form of public transport that would have been displaced by the railways with the kind of age of steam, but not at all. As with horses, the more the railways came, the more this kind of transport actually spread, because there was a need for getting from the railway terminus to other parts of town, and the cities got larger and larger, and there was more and more of a need for that kind of local level public transport. So why would the Reverend Jennings be subject to spectral persecution on an omnibus? I suppose I'm arguing here really that Le Fanu might well be thinking of omnibuses, but I think he's probably thinking of the experience of public transport more generally, including railway transport, and the experience of commuting, I suppose, is what I'm trying to get at here. This is a commuter's nightmare, or a commuter's horror. And we get a sense of this from some other artefacts of roughly the same period. So, one on the left there by Thomas Musgrove Joy, Irish painter, Charing Cross the Bank omnibus from around 1861. And you can just about see, I think, in that not very good reproduction. There's a young woman getting into the omnibus, the interior part, and it's already chock full of passengers, but she wants to get in with her little dog. You can just imagine the other passengers in there. Dear God, where does she think she's going to go with that dog? Pretty much as you would now, really, on a bus or train when other passengers pile in. The one on the right is actually a more famous painting. It's William Le Fanu's Omnibus Life in London, where he's using the omnibus to comment on the omnibus, but also to talk about kind of the crowded nature of urban life more generally. We see people packed into a small omnibus interior. He actually used apparently a real omnibus interior. He built one so he could kind of paint this to to scale. And you see that there are small children sitting on laps. There are people more or less on top of each other, and also forced to look at each other. Cultural historians point out that this is one of the weird new things about modern urban transport in this period, that the older coach travel, because it was very slow, actually led to a certain kind of intimacy, and people would spend many hours together, and they would talk to each other, and sometimes they'd get off the carriage and walk up hills together and give the horses a break, and so on. But in your omnibus and in your railway carriage, somehow the new kinds of rules came in, and people didn't talk to each other, so that they spent a lot of time kind of sitting across from each other, more or less staring at each other's faces, and all feeling deeply uncomfortable. So over time, of course, people evolved ways of dealing with this. Newspapers, magazines, all the kind of cheap publications that were sold at railway stalls, and so on. So you could bury your head in the book. You didn't have to look at the person opposite you. But for a kind of a difficult adjusting period, people were really quite uncomfortable with the commuter experience. Obviously, it has remained quite uncomfortable, and now we have noise-cancelling headphones to help us with these things. But in the 1840s and 50s and even 60s, I think it was actually experienced as a very sort of anxious sort of transport. So not so much spectral monkeys, but other people are the nightmare, I think, that Le Fanu is kind of capturing in that story. I should note probably in passing that later in that story, the Reverend Jennings is persecuted by the monkey to such an extent that when he's actually giving his sermons, which he doesn't do terribly often, but when he does, the monkey comes and perches here on the lectern to disrupt his religious activity. You probably can't see that. Anyway, just to wrap up, I suppose. So, what I'm trying to do is, by main force and speculation, to link together two quite different things here, I suppose, really. Le Fanu, the writer, his attempts to capture something of the uncanny aspects of ordinary urban experience, sort of the anxieties that were brought by, first, the kind of disruption of the city, and then by the kind of enforced experience of commuting of various kinds, and that experience of being pent up with other people, kind of more or less in your face, which of course we all probably experienced with fresh horror during the lockdown period. The idea of having somebody else kind of quite close to you. I still haven't quite gotten over that for public transport. Anyway, so he's doing that. His brother is actually building the infrastructure, and of course, literally, William's work is underwriting Joseph Sheridan's work, because Joseph Sheridan, the writer, is unsurprisingly not quite as prosperous as his brother, the successful engineer, and over time he came to borrow money from his brother to keep his own activities going. So the stories are, in fact, literally underpinned by the railways, but I think there's also a kind of more metaphoric set of connections. Also, I completely agree with the idea of restoring Le Fanu to kind of a more kind of ordinary, everyday axis. Worth bearing in mind that he himself was very much, not always an invisible prince, but often just a kind of a regular commuter. And at various times, he and his wife, Susanna, lived in Bray, Malahide, Kingstown, and he would have come into town every day, I think, on public transport. And then for a long period, he lived in Merrion Square, a house that they rented effectively from his brother-in-law, which might seem to be a nice kind of leafy place to reside, but of course not for some of the period that he was there, because it's right where they built the pavilions of the Industrial Exhibition of 1851 at the back of Dáil Éireann there. So for a period he must have felt like he was just literally unable to escape from other people, the hell that is other people. And on that cheerful note, I might actually stop.